Hello, hello. Welcome to 99 Grit. It is our vision here to inspire you to chase your dreams and turn those dreams into tangible design careers. As you can hear, my voice has changed somewhat. I'm going through some sort of a cold currently, but let's not get bogged down with that. so, Welcome. We're starting to redesign. We're continuing to redesign Amazon.com. We've started off last week with some exciting elements when it comes to looking at some of the components and the inconsistencies of that. So we will review some of it a little bit today. But before we get to the gist of this whole thing, let me just go and share the love into the world. Since we have started, let me just share our live on our beautiful personal private page of mine. Yeah, just bear with me. There you go. Okay, it should be okay. Everything's fantastic. Okay, guys, let's do this. I hope that my voice won't break as much as it could. Let me just take a sip and we can go right ahead and start working away on some cool designs as we speak. So we actually looked at some of the browsing history here at the DualShock 4 wireless controller for PlayStation 4 and this panel on the right hand side here, and we wanted to have a look at the typography and all of those elements. But before we actually get to that state, what I wanted to show you a little bit more is kind of break down and start somewhere. So I'm just going to create a new custom layout here in Photoshop, because I can then use the fanciest brush tools on the planet, and that's what we're going to do to start with. What I wanted to do and kind of show you around is a breakdown of what a design system is, and what we're going to be covering today is, I would say, the first element of this whole thing, using Amazon as an example. So when it comes to design systems, let me just write that down. That's design. I'll move this closer to me. Design systems. Design systems. Well, as a concept, when it comes to design systems, there's a few elements that they're built around. The first one, I don't want to get into too much detail. Typography. Typography is the first one that we have a look at when it comes to structuring or redoing some of the design systems currently. So typography is definitely one of them. Once we know typography, so that's the fonts used in the system, the typefaces, the styles, the thicknesses of the fonts, etc. So everything related to the fonts being used in the system, that's the first element. Then we go into colors. So all the palettes that are being used, the branding elements and things like that. So that's kind of the color palette and all of that. And the third one is spacing. So once we know what kind of fonts we use and what kind of elements, how do the color scheme or the colors, how do they look like, we can then go into finding out or kind of listing out the spacing of those elements in between each other. So using those kind of aspects of this whole thing, then we can start to design some components. So we know what kind of colors we're going to be using on those components, what is the spacing of the elements in between each other, and what kind of typography we'll be using. So that's the components themselves. And we've looked at some of the examples when it comes to design systems designed by Adobe, by IBM, by Oracle, by a lot of different companies, and we've looked at it on our previous live, so I don't want to bore you with that. But the components is basically a list of ways like buttons, panels, tables that use the kind of the assumptions and the rules that we've defined for typography, colors, and spacing to actually design those components. And once we've done the components themselves, then it's good to actually do some templates. So kind of examples of the use of those components together. So kind of how do you put all of those things together to design a dashboard or some sort. And that's the first breakdown. And then there are two additional elements that I wanted to mention here as well. And that's the interaction. I hope that I will fit all of that in nicely. So that's the interaction models, the micro interactions, and how the actual system interacts with the user. And then the last but not least is the actual copywriting. Copywriting. So these are the things related to the communication. How do we communicate with our users and what it's all about? So if I wanted to now just highlight maybe some of those, let me just take maybe a lighter blue. Will this work? Just bear with me. Oh, definitely not this way. But will this work this way? Yeah, that's all right. So when it comes to design systems, again, it's all about typography. Then we have the colors. So let's color that one in. So what kind of colors we're going to be using. Then we have the spacing. So what are the spacing of the elements? How do we put all of that into components so that all of those rules and constraints are actually in place for those? And then we put together some templates when it comes to using those components as an example of how to use them together. And then there are elements like the interaction. So how does the system interact with the user? So that's one thing. And how do we communicate with that user at the same time as well? So that's all the copywriting. That's the communication in the alerts and all of those elements. But what I really wanted to talk to you about today, and that's why I haven't covered the typography with any color yet, because the typography is something that I want to highlight today and go in a little bit more detail about what do you actually mean typography, Andy. And also maybe what we'll do is we'll use a white color on this one, so you can't really see me even coloring this because I'm doing it for a specific reason. I'm going to create one more layer and we're going to do like a drop shadow underneath. So maybe like a light gray. I don't know if it's going to work, but yeah, let's just go crazy with it and see if it works. So let's do some drop shadow elements here. There you go. Drop shadows all around. There you go. So what I wanted to get into today is look at the typography and see what it's all about and how we can actually structure those elements together so that you can have a better understanding of how to design typography elements when you're actually designing any design, well, anything visually representative of what you want to communicate to any recipient. So we're going to look at typography today. So going back to our example when it comes to Amazon, the inconsistencies of this whole thing, as you remember, have been covered in detail in our previous live, so I don't want to bore you with that. But what we are going to be taking is this specific panel, because it's really exciting to have a look at this one specifically of what Amazon has actually done to this little element on the interface. So let's just have a look at this one. And we won't be looking at the entire thing when it comes to. Let me just move it around a bit. Okey-dokey. Let me just move this away to the side so we have a good understanding of what design systems are and where we are. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the typography itself. So going back to, let's do another layer here, to our beautiful brush tool. We can maybe use the bluish, I'd say. Okay, that's fine. We just don't need that much of a thickness, and that's cool. So when it comes to typography, this is the first element that we always look at when we're designing any design system or actually auditing any existing web page. We want to see, because the typography is one visual element that conveys a lot of meaning, that kind of has a big impact on the look and feel of the system. So therefore, it's pretty important for us to actually understand what kind of decisions have been made so far to accommodate the needs of that specific system. It's all about, when it comes to Amazon, there are some photographs obviously, and there are some elements to display the products themselves, but everything else, it's like, there are fonts everywhere. There are fonts describing all of those elements of interactions, describing the elements related to the product itself, and obviously the way we kind of interact with the user. So that's pretty intense and pretty important for the user to actually comprehend, and it should be designed properly and nicely. So going back to our example, as you can see, when it comes to the fonts that have been used in the specific system, when it comes to Amazon, we have, I'm just going to write down fonts, or I'll actually use the term typography so we're on the same page. So typography, there you go. So we're looking at typography, and first things first. So I'm gonna list out how many fonts this specific panel is using. So we have the 46, which is one typeface and the size of the font. So it's pretty big, it's pretty bold, so that's one. Then we have this one, which is like a second one, and I think it correlates with the S here as well, so it's like number 2. Then we have this italic light gray font, which is like number 3 when it comes to the style. Then we have this little aspect here when it comes to this shipping and import fees, and that's not italic, and the gray is slightly different from this one, so that tells me that this element is actually number 4, style number 4, and we haven't even covered 50 pixels of the panel yet. So that's number 4. Then we have the link, which is number 5, and I don't want to get into this little drop down thing here. That's the interactive element, so I would cover those in the interaction right here, so not just now. Then we have this get it for less with trade-in, which is like the 6th level of the of typography, and see what you'll save is another style of the font that Amazon designers decided to use. This color one, this font, I think that it correlates with this one, so I'm not going to be going into too much detail on that. And this magma red, I think, correlates to that one, so that's fine. We are safe there. Now, when it comes to buy new, this element here, I think that it's a little bit bigger than this one, so this would be style number 7. Then we have this little 96 kind of you know, the US dollars or the cents, that's like number 8 when it comes to the style of the font. And then we go to buy used, which is number 9, and then this 004, which is number 10. And I'd say that this 38, well, that's the same one as this one. So that's already 10 different font styles, and we haven't even covered the half of the panel. Going further, the platform correlates, I think, with this, and that's fine. The PlayStation is something, I think, related to that one, so that's fine. Then we have the in stock, and I think that it's similar to this one, so I'm going to leave it alone. Then when it comes to ships from and sold by Amazon, this is a new one because it's smaller than any other of those gray ones there, so that's like number 11. The next one is this one, which is not gray like the one we've just highlighted, so this is number 12, and it's smaller than anything else we've already listed out. And same goes for this bold element, so the Poland wait until Thursday, whatever, to get it, that's 13. Then we have 13 hours, 37 minutes, which is number 14 because it's got a different color. And we have the links we've covered, but this is a small link, so this is like number 15 of the font type so far. Then the quantity deliverable, that's fine. Add to cart, I think that we've covered this font already. Other sellers on Amazon, we have got that. The links we have, because that's the same one as this one. Add to list is exactly the same as it was, and the share button is there as well. So as you can see, we have listed, let me just use maybe a black font. We have listed 15 different fonts or font styles. And this is just one panel, guys, one panel on one product page. It's pretty massive when it comes to, the amount of different fonts that have been used for this one little panel, but there's quite a lot of interactivity and quite a lot of information conveyed in that panel. So maybe there was a reason for that. But there's a few things that I would definitely want to share with you today when it comes to typography. Let me just take a sip of my coffee, just to take care of my silk voice, if you like. And when it comes to typography itself, there's a few secrets that I wanted to share with you, how I look at typography and how I challenge these kinds of layouts as it stands. So we've already covered the amount of fonts being used, and I can actually disable the layer, and I will show you some of the typography tips and tricks that I that I use to actually make this thing redesigned. So as you can see here, most of these fonts are, the only difference between those is either they're being bolded up, right? So they're like being bold. Let me just maybe do this pink one. So they're bold, or they differ in size or the thickness of the font, and that's pretty much it. So they are either bigger, they are either smaller or thicker, and they differ in color. So these are the three elements that most designers use when it comes to designing the hierarchy of typography on any page. So when it comes to the things that you can change, and I would just maybe the prioritization of importance when it comes to fonts. So as you can see here, there's a few elements that these guys have done already. So they are differentiating what's really important on this page, like this 46 and this buy new 46 and this in stock. The main difference here is the size of the font. So it's basically a bigger font, and therefore we want the user to understand that it's more important of an information or more important content for them to actually comprehend. So the size is the first thing that we can differentiate our prioritization of the importance on the interface. So the size of the font is the first thing. The second one is, as you can see here, this is bold, and this is bold, and this is bold. So that's the thickness, I would say, the thickness of the actual typeface, right? So if we're doing big bold letters, it's pretty important for the end user to know, right? So it's a very important information. Now, if you want to even kind of create an even more interesting element or even more impactful visually, then we go to the third element, and you can see it here somewhere. You can see this one. I'm going to use the big one. You can see that it's grayed out a little bit. You can see that this is blue. You can see that this is green, right? And you can see that this is actually highlighted with a button which is yellow. So this is another aspect of using some of the elements that we would like for the user to comprehend as this being important, and that's the color of that font. So these are the three main ones that most of people use, and I always challenge that, because to me there are other elements that that can actually be useful in more in more challenging or more constrained environments when it comes to design. And I would add a few more things to the mix. So one of them would be to me, which is not used anywhere on this page, and that's the capitalization. Right. So this is basically writing everything in bold, in uppercase letters. So you can have an effect on that, and that also can add a little bit to the mix when it comes to the importance. And then the last but not least element that I would add also always is kerning. And when it comes to kerning, font kerning, it sounds difficult, but it's actually the letter spacing. That's what it actually is. Letter spacing. So to illustrate an example, you can actually do that pretty easily in Photoshop. So if we do that's maybe a little bit smaller than that. Let's just use something like maybe 60-ish, so I can describe and kind of show you what it's all about. So as you can see, this is already capitalized, and that's fine. But when I mean letter spacing, that's actually right here. So this is the distance in between the letters. So I'll use this one. So that's that distance right here. So that's kerning, right? And this can also help us in making sure that we prioritize the fonts in a proper manner. So now to break down an example, I would basically maybe just get rid of this one, get rid of this font, and maybe just get rid of the stuff on the right, or maybe just let's leave it there. So we're seeing the panel, and we're seeing the importance elements when it comes to the fonts themselves. Let me just see if I'm on the right layer. Okay, cool. So let's maybe redesign some of those elements. Maybe we can start with this one. And what we want to have a conscious decision around when it comes to designing a panel like that, and it comes to typography specifically, we want to have a conscious choice as a designer of what is important and what isn't, right? And looking at those elements here, we have the thick font, a big font, a little bit smaller, and a little bit less thicker. Then we have the gray. So we have a couple of ways of actually differentiating these things in between each other. But specifically, I think the biggest challenge is right here, because we have just bolded fonts, a little bit of color change, and a little bit of size change, and that's it. So the way that I would try and do it, we have the platform, which is a separate font, and the PlayStation, which is another font. And the only difference between those two is the thickness of the font. So the size is the same, the typeface is the same, and the only difference is the bold element of this font. And there are other ways of actually doing that. So let me just break down a few examples. It's all about kind of creating a balance of importance when it comes to typography. So let me just illustrate that with a simple example. So if we go to a font that's let's say it's going to be black. So let me just open up the and we'll do like title number 1, and that'll be that. Let me just go with something of a blackish element, and I'll just do no kerning, no capitalization, just really thick. I'm using objective font. It's got quite a few of those styles when it comes to being really light, really thin, all the way to being really black and super heavy, right? So this is like the easiest way to actually differentiate the importance of that specific font, and that's what the guys at Amazon have actually done here, right? So they have I'll use the same things maybe. So that's like platform, and then semicolon, and then we have PlayStation 4. Okay, let's just do that. Both of them, align them to the left when it comes to the paragraph. There you go. I don't want to get into the details of Photoshop. You can do it in any software. You can do it in Word documents if you want, because it's just about how to use and put those fonts together. So the things that have changed at Amazon is they basically said, okay, so let's do this one in bold and this one in something of a regular, I think, thickness, right? So this is the differentiation of the importance of those two fonts, right? So it's like the platform is more important because it's thick, and the PlayStation 4 is a secondary element, and that's because it's not bolded up. It's not as thick when it comes to the typography, the font that has been used. But when it comes to all of those subsequent elements like ships from Amazon, let's even use that one. So we have like 3 levels of importance. So I'll show you how I try to break these things down. So it's like in stock, which is like a 4th style, and they've done it bigger. So it's like 72 maybe, yeah, something like that. And I think that for the sake of this exercise, we can actually do platform PlayStation 4, and this is a little bit smaller, I'd say. Right, so this kind of represents it more when it comes to what we actually, what are we actually saying. So that's that. So we have the PlayStation 4, and we have the in stock. Oh, come on. There you go. So that's kind of showing us what we have there, and then we have the last but not least element, and that's the ships from and sold by Amazon.com, and that's paragraph, and that's pretty small, and that's pretty, let's do maybe 18 or something like that. Well, that's a little bit small. 24, maybe a little bit more than that. Let's do 36. There you go, 36, and it seems to be regular, but the color is actually something of a grayish color. So that's what they did, right? In a nutshell. So we have the platform, PlayStation 4 in stock, and it ships from Amazon, and that's it. So they've only used 3 of those elements. So they've used the size, they've used the thickness, and they've used the color of how to actually prioritize the information on the interface when we actually look at those things, right? So I want to show you a few tips and tricks how to accommodate these kinds of challenges when you get into these kind of elements, displaying text within text, so that it actually is understandable to the user a little bit more. If you have any questions, then definitely fire away, write a comment. I'd be happy to respond to those. A sip of coffee for the lovely silk voice. And okay, now let's break it down even further. So let's see, let's have a look at what we could do if we were kind of redesigning this whole thing to maintain that the prioritization when it comes to in-stock is the most important element. So actually, let me just break it down from the perspective of how I understand this information being displayed from the perspective of the importance. So to me, the in-stock is the first priority. This is the most important element of information. Platform being bold but smaller is the second one. PlayStation 4 being the third one, and this is the fourth element of importance. And this is a very conscious decision you need to make as a designer when you are putting these fonts together. So what is the most important font element, or the text or the information you want the user to understand, and then work away from that one. So that's that. So if we wanted to have a little bit of a play around when it comes to these fonts, what could we do to keep a balance? And obviously we can do like an overkill, right? And so I've seen some of the designers in the past kind of doing it like an overkill, and you can obviously then say that they are struggling with inspiration, they're struggling with the amount of with the amount of, well, I would say, I don't know, having these tips and tricks like the size and thickness and color and capitalization and kerning as tips or tools at their display. So what we could do is basically go with, let's go with super bold and super big. Then we can go to, a little bit maybe bolder of an element right there. Then we go to regular, and then we go to this one. And obviously this is already looking, well, a little bit designy, but at the end of the day, this is too much of an overkill when it comes to that font weight. So to actually come up with some other ways of doing this, I would go maybe for something like this. So let's maybe, instead of having this bold, we can actually do it differently. We can use the same regular element that the PlayStation 4 has, but we can make it uppercase. And this already shows us that we haven't changed the font weight, so the thickness is exactly the same of the font. The size is exactly the same. The color is exactly the same. The capitalization is the only thing we've changed. And already we can assume that, okay, so the platform is a little bit more important because it's in uppercase. It's all caps. And therefore, we could assume that this information is a little bit more important than the PlayStation, right? And then we can play around with, okay, so if we wanted to change this a little bit more, well, let's maybe do this and change the color, because this level of importance is pretty close to each other. So maybe we can then just take the PlayStation element and maybe change the color to a little bit more of a grayish state, right? And therefore, if I take those two away, you can already see that just through the capitalization of that and graying this one out, I am maintaining the importance effect of this element here. So instead of doing it bold and black and regular and black, I can do it without any bolds. I can just play around with the capitalization, keeping one of them in black and turning the other one to gray. So let's imagine that we don't have a font that actually has any of those standard alphabet letters, and it's only caps. So if you wanted to maybe take something like that, and let's say that the client says, no, it all needs to be in caps, what would you do? And obviously, if we do this one in caps, let's just bear with me. The in stock one, if we do this one in uppercase, this starts to look a little bit blocky. And it's kind of an overkill now. So it's kind of showing us that, first of all, it's bigger and it's in uppercase on top of that. And it's kind of starting to be a little bit overwhelming of an element. And it's all a balance of those four elements together. So how do we actually put those things together? And obviously, if we do, and turn that bold on top of that, then that becomes really important, but really, starts to get into a little bit of a ugly state this time as well. So what I usually do, it's sometimes when we put too big of a font in this kind of element, and we bold it up, and we need to do it because it's the most important aspect, we can then play around with other elements, like maybe we can work with the size. So let's then try to maybe go from 72 to 60, just to make it a little bit smaller, And it doesn't need to be as big as it was. So it can be just smaller because it's already uppercase and it's already bold. So we don't need to make it as big as that. Now, there's a cool trick that I would use here, even if I had to go even further down when it comes to the font size, just to mitigate the kind of the importance. I think that it still looks like as the most important element because it's uppercase and it is still bold. So, but if I wanted to kind of I'm running out of size, for example, when it comes to the attribute that I'm using to actually minimize the impact this font is having, then I would go into kerning. So I would say, okay, so maybe instead of the size, instead of the color, instead of the uppercase, I would just go into kerning, and I would say, okay, let's just space the letters out a little bit more, or even more than that. Let's do like 300, right? And then we go into something that starts to look a little bit lighter because of the letter spacings themselves. So as you can see, we're kind of maintaining the same state. So we are looking that the platform is more important than PlayStation, and in stock is more important than the platform and PlayStation put together, because the spacing of the fonts, as well as the thickness of the font and the uppercase element of this font, still keeps it on top of those elements, but it's not as big anymore, and it's not as condensed anymore, so it kind of looks lighter a little bit. And then we have this one element at the very end of the day when it comes to ships to and from, well, ships from and sold by Amazon, and it's exactly the same one as this one. So what could we do with this element in that regard? So definitely we can, if we had to go with the uppercase again, for example, to do it this way, then it kind of steals a little bit of thunder when it comes to the platform and the in-stock elements. So maybe it's actually a good idea to keep it without the capitalization, without the uppercase elements to them, and it kind of works as it kind of stands, right? So these are the elements that I would definitely try to cover and convey every time you are putting some fonts together in your design systems. So it's not just about the size and the font weight or the thickness and the color, but it's also the capitalization and the letter spacing that you can actually use to your benefit to add more variety, add a little bit more excitement to the fonts, to the typography element itself. As you can see here in the Amazon example, there's nothing uppercase, and the kerning of the font is pretty standard, so they haven't used those two elements. So that's something that I would add to the mix to actually have a look at each one of those elements and start to redesign them in accordance with what we're trying to achieve here. Because this goes, if we just quickly go to one other example, let's say maybe the pricing element, right? So we would go maybe with the 4696, sorry, the 4696 USD, all right? So we have like 3 different fonts for each one of those. So let's just do it this way. So we have the dollar sign, we have the 96, and we have the 46 bucks, right? And we have the plus 21.19 shipping and import fees, etc. Right? So that's the stuff right there. So I'll get rid of the uppercase, obviously. I'll get rid of the kerning, and I'll work around with those. So we have those 3 elements. So we have this one, this one, this one, and this one. Just move it to the top, so we can play around with those. So we know that the biggest and the most important element on this whole thing is the 46 bucks that somebody needs to pay. So sure, we can do the size overkill, we can do it in black, and maybe we can even increase the font dramatically like that, right? Maybe black is a little bit of an overkill, so maybe just let's do it in bold, right? Then the 96 could be as they did in their example, be like 96 and the S. But I think that what we did here, we've actually increased the thickness of this one versus this one, which creates a different effect. But again, we've only used the size and the thickness of those, right? So that kind of shows us where we stand when it comes to that. I'm actually gonna lower the letter spacing for this one to so that it's actually closer to each other, and same goes for this one. I'll do like -50 as well, so that they are closer to each other, just to make them a little bit more visually pleasing. So that's that, and we're kind of looking at the same things that they did, so like different levels of that. And then we have the shipping and import fees, and we can maybe go dramatically further down, like to maybe 16, maybe 18 or something like that. And the good thing about capitalization and the uppercase elements is that they're more readable when they're really small. So if we do that, it's a little bit better when it comes to actually reading that font at very small at very small levels of size. And as you can see, the color is exactly the same. The size is dramatically smaller, but it is uppercase. So therefore, it is another layer of importance, because all I need to do now is just add, let's say, one more element underneath it, and just change the capitalization and the color to gray, let's say. And that's a very easy fix. So I know that this is the most important thing. This is, the second most important element, third one, and fourth one. So these elements, when it comes to capitalization, colors, and the size, and the thickness of the font, and the letter spacing, these are the elements that dramatically increase the way that we actually look at any given structure or information, and helps us dramatically to use these tips and tricks to actually create the importance of those elements on the interface. So going back to our brush tool, as you can see here, we've kind of tried to kind of maintain. Oh, come on! We've tried to maintain the level of importance. So it was like 1, 2. This is like also 2. This is number 3, right? So that's what we tried to do, and I think that we achieved it here as well. So we've got number 1, we've got number 2, we've got number 3. This one is number 3 when it comes to level of importance, and this is number 4. And we've done this through these little tips and tricks. So the guys at Amazon, they did that through, this is gray and a little bit darker gray than this one, because this is a little bit lighter gray, but also it's like italic. So it's a different type, a different style for that specific font. And I think that what we did is a little bit more interesting, but that's down to somebody else to decide. When it comes to the differentiation, this is more obvious. This is black and uppercase, and this is gray and not uppercase. So it's more understandable to me what's the most important element on this interface and what is the least important element of this specific aspect. Same goes for this one. So we've done the platform, we've uppercased that, we've done this one with a little bit of a grayish factor. This is also uppercase and bold, but because we didn't want it to be as heavy, we've increased the letter spacing, and we've left the sold ships by Amazon as a separate one. So to me, I think that we've again covered some of the aspects. That this is the most important thing, this is the second one, this is the third one, and this is the fourth one. I would probably look at maybe differentiating these two elements a little bit further than that, because the only difference between those is the actual size of the font. The color is exactly the same, and the typeface is exactly the same also. So we can then play around with, okay, let's just turn it maybe smaller, but make it blacker, and it still should work, right? So because it's dramatically smaller, it still is less important than the PlayStation 4. So it's all about playing around with those five elements when it comes to typography, and that's what I always go through. I copy all of those elements from the entire panel, I put them right next to each other, and then I try to come up with taking it panel by panel when it comes to the importance of using these 5 elements. So I'll use the size of the font, the weight of the font, so the thickness, the color of the font, the capitalization, and the letter spacing, so the kerning of that font. And that dramatically helps me to actually accommodate any need that I have in my interface designs to come up with some interesting prioritizations of importance, if you like. So I try to put those fonts together in that manner. So guys, that's the end of the live pretty much. So we've covered the typography element of how to tackle that element, how to list it all out, and then how to kind of redesign it on the basis of those 5 elements. So the size, thickness, color, capitalization, and kerning is the 5 elements that I usually use to accommodate any font or typography needs of any interface. So I recommend that you use those as well in your daily work, and let us know how it's going, and definitely where you're watching this from would be interesting for us to see and hear as well. So I'm looking forward to your interactions and to your feedback regarding these, and I hope these are useful. Have a great week, and I would have a challenge for you guys. If you could try and maybe look at those 5 elements of typography, prioritization of importance, and see what you can come up with, what kind of compositions when it comes to typography you can come up with your designs on a daily basis, and maybe share some of those through the comments, and maybe through putting some of the layouts or kind of screencasts of your screens to our 99 grid page. And I invite you to this Thursday's webinar. It's at 10 a.m. CET. We're going to be covering design thinking elements, so a little bit something a little bit different than what we're doing here. We will be looking at design thinking as a whole, as a process, and we want to open up to questions and have that exciting, make it as exciting as possible to everybody attending. Definitely reach out to us on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Instagram and YouTube as well. We're fighting for subscribers and likes like crazy, so anything you do in that regard is pretty massive for us and a huge support. So I wanted to thank you for joining us, and I'm looking forward to our conversations and interactions. And I will see you in the next live on Monday, and hopefully I'll see some of you on our Thursday webinar as well, where we'll be talking about design thinking. So have a great week, guys. I'm really looking forward to interactions, and I'll see you around.